Excellence. Mesdames et messieurs, je m'appelle Agnès Chani et je suis la présidente du CEST, une association pour la promotion de la francophonie et du plurilinguisme basée à Vienne.
We're
C'est un
based in
grand
Vienna.
plaisir d'être
I'm
aujourd'hui
very
avec vous
pleased
pour
to be
cette
with you
discussion
today
en
for this
français
French
au Palais
held
ce lieu
discussion in the
emblématique et
Hofburg
historique
Palace,
de la
which is a
diplomatie.
historic venue for
Vous le savez
diplomacy.
sans doute, à l'issue du
As you're
congrès de
definitely
Vienne,
aware,
qui s'est
following
tenu
the Congress
ici
of
même
Vienna, which was held
en
in this very spot,
1814-1815,
in
l'acte final a été rédigé en
1994-1995,
français.
the final act was
Langue qui
drafted
commençait
in
à
French.
supplanter le
And this
latin
was a
comme
language
langue
which at the
universelle
time
de la
started
diplomatie.
replacing Latin as the language of diplomacy.
Aujourd'hui, c'est
Today,
l'anglais qui joue ce rôle.
English plays this rôle.
Langue officielle de 67 pays.
It is the
C'est son statut
official
de
language
langue
of
commune
67
utilisé
countries,
par défaut qui
used
lui
by
donne ce
default,
monopole dans
which
de
gives it
nombreux
a
domaines
monopoly
comme
in
le
many
commerce,
areas
la
such as
recherche
trade,
et la
research,
diplomatie.
and diplomacy.
L'influence de la culture
The
anglophone,
influence of
notamment à travers les médias, le
English-speaking culture
cinéma, la
can be seen
musique et
in
la
media,
littérature,
music,
a
and
contribué
literature
à la
inter
popularité
alia.
de l'anglais
This has
dans
led
le
to
monde.
English's popularity across
Pourtant,
the globe.
des voix s'élèvent
However,
pour une plus grande
There
utilisation du
are
français
increasing voices
dans les
calling for
discussions
the use of
internationales.
French in international
La
discussions.
francophonie forme une communauté
The
linguistique
French-speaking
d'importance,
community is an
rassemblant
important one.
29
It
pays,
brings together
dont c'est la langue
29
officielle
countries with
ou
French
co-officielle,
as the official or
auquel il faut
co-official
ajouter
language.
7 autres pays
I would
où
add
il est
7
parlé au
others to those
quotidien par
where French
plus de
is
20%
spoken
de la
daily
population.
by more than 20% of the
De nombreux
population.
diplomates, et
Numerous
notamment les
diplomats, in
Autrichiens,
particular Austrians,
maîtrisent
speak
parfaitement
French
cette langue.
perfectly.
Alors, qu'apporte l'usage
So,
du français
what
dans
does
les
using French
discussions
bring to
internationales?
international discussions?
Pour en débattre, nous avons réuni
So as to
4 ambassadeurs
debate
basés
this,
à
we
Vienne
have brought together
ou venus
4
de Genève
ambassadors
qui
from
vont nous
Vienna
livrer
or
leur
Geneva
témoignage
who will
sur la
be talking
place du
about
français
their
et
experience
du
regarding French and its
dans
role in
les
multilingualism
discussions
in
internationales.
international discussions.
Permettez-moi de vous les présenter.
I'd like to present our panelists.
Tout d'abord, Henri Monceau,
First,
qui est le
Henri
représentant
Monceau,
permanent
he's
de
the permanent
l'Organisation
representative of the
internationale de la
International
francophonie,
Organization
OIF,
of
auprès des Nations
Francophonie
Unies à Genève
to the
et à
United
Vienne.
Nations
Depuis
Office
le
and other
15 mai
international
2023, fonction
organizations
qu'il
in
avait
Geneva
également assurée entre 2017
since
et
2003,
2020.
as
Et
well as from
entre-temps, il a été
2017 to
directeur
2020. In the
de
interim,
la
he had also
francophonie
served as director
économique et numérique
of
de
economic and
l'OIF.
digital francophonie of
Au
the
sein de la
organization.
francophonie, il a aussi
OIF.
travaillé comme
There,
coordinateur
he also
programmatique et
has worked
scientifique.
as programmatic and
Deuxième
scientific
forum mondial de
coordinator
la
of the
langue française.
Second World
Ainsi,
Forum
il a
on
été
French language.
également membre du
He is
comité de
also a member of
pilotage
the pilot
du
committee
réseau
of
d'innovation
the
francophone.
Francophone Innovation Network.
Il est titulaire de
He
plusieurs
holds
masters
several
de
master's degrees
l'université
from
Paris
the
1, Panthéon-Sorbonne et
University of
du
Paris 1,
CNAM.
Sorbonne, and
des masters
CNAM,
économie
as
gestion.
well as a master's in
Et
economics
il a
and
également,
management.
si mes informations
And
sont bonnes, vous
also,
avez
if
étudié
I'm not
l'histoire
mistaken,
médiévale
you studied medieval
à
history
l'Université catholique de Louvain.
at the Catholic University of Louvain.
Ensuite, son Excellence Madame Caroline Vermeulen,
Caroline
qui est
Vermeulen.
depuis 2022
Since
l'ambassadrice
2002,
du
she
Royaume
has
de Belgique
been the
auprès de la République d'Autriche,
permanent
mais
representative
également
of
de
the
la
Kingdom
République
of Belgium.
slovaque, de la République de Slovénie et
She's
de la
also
Bosnie-Herzégovine.
served in Slovenia and Bosnia.
Elle est aussi représentante
Herzegovina.
permanente auprès des Nations Unies et des
She, as I
organisations
said, is
internationales
permanent
aériennes.
representative
Elle
of
rejoint le
Belgium
service diplomatique
to UNOV.
du ministère des Affaires
She is part of the
étrangères du Royaume
diplomatic
de Belgique
services of the
en
Foreign
1997.
Ministry since
Elle a été en
2017
poste
in
depuis à
Belgium.
Pékin,
She was in
Taipei, Moscou,
Beijing, Taipei,
Tokyo et
Moscow,
Bruxelles.
Tokyo, and Brussels.
Elle possède une maîtrise
She
en histoire
has a
contemporaine de
master's in
l'Université
contemporary
catholique de
history
Louvain
from
et
the
un
same
diplôme en
Catholic
études
University
européennes
of
du
Louvain,
collège.
as
Oui,
well
vous
as
êtes
the
croisés,
European
exactement, mais pas dans
College.
pas la même
So
histoire.
you crossed paths, but of course not studying the
Diplôme en
same type
études
of
européennes
history.
du Collège d'Europe. Elle parle le
She
néerlandais, le
speaks
français,
Dutch,
l'allemand, l'anglais et
French,
l'italien.
German, English, and Italian.
L'anglais et l'anglais. J'oublie.
English, as I said, yes. It's hard to keep track.
Monsieur
Now,
Albert Dolé, Gueux Albert Dolé, est le
Mr.
représentant
Albert
permanent
Dolé,
adjoint de
he
la
is the
République de
deputy
Côte
permanent
d'Ivoire
representative of the
auprès
Republic
de
of Côte
l'Office des
d'Ivoire
Nations Unies et des autres
to
organisations internationales en
the
Autriche
Vienna-based
depuis septembre
organizations
2021.
since
Il est diplomate
September
de carrière.
2021. He's a
En
career diplomat
2004,
in
il entre au ministère
2004.
ivoirien des Affaires
Became
étrangères.
part of the
Où il a
foreign ministry of his
occupé
country,
plusieurs
where
postes à
he held several
responsabilité,
high-ranking
notamment il a été
posts,
secrétaire
including
général adjoint
the
du
Deputy
ministère
Secretary
d'État.
General of
au
State,
ministère des Affaires
the
étrangères,
foreign
et directeur de la
minister,
stratégie et
as
de la
well as
planification.
director of
Il a
strategy.
été en
He
poste en Côte d'Ivoire, en
served
Égypte et
in
au
Côte
Soudan.
d'Ivoire, Egypt, and Sudan.
Je ne vais pas pouvoir citer tous ses diplômes
Of
académiques,
course, I can't
mais
go
il est
through his full
notamment
resume.
titulaire d'une
But
maîtrise de
he
droit
holds
privé
a master's
de
in
l'Université
private
d'Abidjan
law
Cocody,
from the
d'un
University
diplôme
of Abidjan,
d'études
as well
internationales
as
de
an
droit humanitaire
international
de San Remo
diploma
et d'un
from San
certificat de
Remo
l'Institut coréen de
and
formation et de
a,
recherche. Il est
a
officier de
diploma
l'Ordre
from the
national de la
Korean
République de Côte d'Ivoire.
Research Institute.
Enfin, j'ai le plaisir de vous présenter
Finally,
l'ambassadrice
I'd like to
Delphine
present
Orno-Pueza,
Her
qui
Excellency, Ms.
est depuis
Delphine Honora
2022
Poza,
également
since
ambassadrice représentante
2002,
permanente
has
de la
been
France
the permanent
auprès des
representative
Nations
of
Unies et
France
des organisations
to
internationales
Vienna-based
à Vienne.
organizations.
Auparavant, elle était directrice des
Before
affaires
this, she was
stratégiques,
Director
de
of
sécurité
Strategic
et de
Affairs,
désarmement au ministère
Security
français
and
de l'Europe
Disarmament of the
et des
French
Affaires
Ministry
étrangères.
of
Elle a déjà été
European
affectée à
Affairs.
Londres, à
She
Hong Kong et
was
Paris,
posted in
et elle a suivi un
London
cursus
as well
de
as
sciences
Paris
politiques
and
et
has
sociales à
studied
Paris et Berlin.
political
Elle
sciences
parle français,
in Paris
allemand,
and Berlin.
anglais
She
et a des notions de
speaks
tchèque et de
Czech,
chinois.
Chinese, German, English, and French.
Pour commencer cette discussion, j'aimerais aborder les pratiques,
To start our
les
discussions,
pratiques de
I would
francophonie au
like
sein
to
des organisations
talk about
internationales.
francophonie
Et je voudrais me
practices
tourner
in
vers la
international
Belgique
organizations.
pour lui
I'm going
demander de
to
nous
ask
dresser
our
un
representative from
enfin,
Belgium
la
first.
Belgique,
And of course, I
pour
mean
nous
you,
faire
madam,
dresser un portrait des pratiques linguistiques
such that
ici à
she
Vienne,
perhaps
et
paints a
notamment au
picture
Centre
of the linguistic
international,
practices
lors
here in
des
Vienna,
discussions
and
entre
in particular
diplomates.
in the
Bien que l'anglais soit
VIC
généralement
amongst
prédominant,
diplomats.
est-ce
While we
qu'il y
know
a des cas
that
spécifiques ou d'autres
English
langues
is
sont utilisées? Est-ce qu'il y a
prevalent,
des
are there
organisations
other
internationales où on parle
specific
plus d'autres
cases?
langues?
Are there other international organizations where more languages are
Bonjour à tous.
spoken?
Merci d'abord
Good afternoon.
aux organisateurs
Thank you very
de
much
m'avoir
to the
conviée
organizers
à
for
ce
having
panel.
invited me to this panel.
Par rapport à votre première question,
When it comes
bien
to your
sûr,
first
officiellement,
question,
vous savez
as
que
you know,
l'ONU
officially at the United Nations,
assure l'interprétation dans 6
interpretation
langues
is
officielles,
offered in
étant
6
l'anglais,
official
l'arabe, le
languages,
chinois,
that is
l'espagnol,
English,
le
French,
français et le
Spanish,
russe.
Arabic,
Ces
Chinese,
services
and
d'interprétation
Russian.
permettent une
These
communication claire et
services
concise entre
allow
les
for
participants sur les
precise and
questions
clear communication among
majeures et quelque part,
stakeholders
c'est
on
un
major
moteur
issues. Many
d'égalité
times this can be a
linguistique.
vector of
Aussi, au
equality,
sein du CTBTO,
linguistic equality. In
le
CTBTO,
multilinguisme est un sujet qui est fort
multilingualism
mis en
is
avant,
in
mais
the
pour une
forefront.
organisation de la taille du
But
CTBTO,
given the
qui n'est pas
size
très,
of
très
the
grande,
organization,
ce n'est pas
it's not a
facile,
large
c'est assez
organization.
compliqué
It's
d'assurer une
rather
traduction
difficult to
de
ensure
tous les
that there is
documents, y
translation of
compris
all
les documents
documents,
très
including
techniques,
very
dans
technical
toutes les
ones,
langues et
in
tout
all
le temps.
languages at all times.
Et il ne faut pas oublier que cette traduction
Let
et
us
cette
not forget also that
interprétation a
interpretation and
également un
translation
coût. Donc
come at a
c'est
cost.
important de promouvoir
So
le
it's important to
multilinguisme auprès des
promote
institutions
multilingualism
internationales,
in international
mais cela a
organizations.
également des conséquences,
However, this
notamment
does have
en matière
consequences,
financière,
usually
sur le
financial
budget
ones,
et en matière de
budget
ressources
impacts,
humaines.
as well as in terms of
Alors,
human
j'ai parlé des
resources.
6 langues
I
officielles,
talked
et
about the
c'est
6
bien,
official
mais
languages.
cela veut quand même dire que de
That's
très
good,
nombreuses délégations
but
ne
what also
négocient
means
pas
is that
dans leur
many
langue
delegations are
maternelle,
not negotiating
ce
in
qui
their
pose un
native language.
véritable défi
This is
en
a true
termes de
challenge when it
précision,
comes
de
to
rigueur de
being
pensée,
clear,
de nuance,
sharing
et
thoughts,
d'efficacité des débats,
subtleties, and
et aussi
ensuring
de
the debates are effective,
compréhension.
but also in terms of
C'est un
understanding.
problème qui
It
vaut
is
d'autant
an
plus que
issue
dans des
which is
réunions
particularly
plus
important
informelles,
that in the more
souvent
informal
on est, comme
meetings,
vous l'avez dit
usually
aussi, on est
or
dans
often,
une
as you said,
hégémonie
we
et
see a
un monopole de
monopoly
l'anglais,
of
qui
English.
certes est la lingua
In these
franca,
cases,
celle
English
qui
is
est
being
parlée,
used as the lingua franca,
la langue commune au plus de
or the common
délégations,
language for many
mais
delegations.
Ce qui fait aussi qu'elle souffre de la faible connaissance, et
But it
surtout
also means that
dans les
English is
domaines techniques
impacted
de ceux qui
by
la parlent. Et
lack of knowledge
cette
in technical
tendance,
domains
quelque
for
part,
those
au
speaking it.
monolinguisme
This is a
empêche
situation where there is just
l'inclusivité
one
des
language being used,
négociations.
and sometimes it
C'est
means that
aussi difficile
negotiations aren't as
d'avoir des
inclusive as they
experts venant
could
des
be.
capitales
Sometimes
qui
it's
parlent
difficult to have
suffisamment,
experts from capital
l'anglais
with sufficient
pour
level of
pouvoir,
English
bien
such that they can
négocier
negotiate
ou aussi
successfully
se
or
mobiliser à
even
l'échelle
take
internationale.
action internationally.
Par opposition, le
On the other
multilinguisme
hand,
permet un
multilingualism
véritable dialogue et donne un
allows for
accès
genuine dialogue.
à
It provides access to
l'information et la
information
possibilité de participer
and
à cette
gives a way
construction commune
to
que nous
participate in
essayons
this
de
common
réaliser
vision,
au sein des organisations
what we're attempting to
internationales.
build in
Ce
international
traitement
organizations.
égalitaire du plus de langues possible est très
So greater
important
equality
et c'est
with
d'ailleurs
more
vraiment un élément
languages.
clé,
This is
de
very
l'ONU
important.
qui
It
est-
is a
qui est
crucial
riche par sa
element of
diversité.
the United
Je
Nations,
voudrais peut-être
which
aussi souligner
draws
une
strength from its diversity.
particularité,
I'd like to highlight a
ici à
particular
Vienne, et pas
feature
seulement,
of
c'est,
Vienna,
la
but not just Vienna, that
particularité
is
du GAF, du
the
groupe des ambassadeurs
group
francophones
of French-speaking ambassadors, or the GAF. Usually,
internationales, on
in
se regroupe
international
plutôt par
organizations,
région,
there are
où on
regional
se
groups,
regroupe par valeurs ou intérêts communs,
or those who are brought
mais
together
pas
by
souvent
values
on
or
se
common
regroupe par
interest. It's
langue.
not very
Alors
often
que
that there are
justement, le
groups,
GAF
linguistic
représente une
groups.
opportunité pour
But indeed, the
réunir
GAF is a group that is
des
brought
pays
together.
d'horizons très différents, de
There are
régions
countries that are
différentes, qui
extremely
n'ont pas
different from very different
spécialement les
regions,
mêmes valeurs,
not necessarily
mais qui
sharing the
se
same
véhiculent du
values, but
français
who all share
pour entamer
French
un dialogue et pour échanger
for
entre eux
discussion
et
and
finalement
exchanges,
contribuer à une
which
meilleure
in turn
compréhension
contributes to
de la
better
position
understanding
des autres. Donc,
of
je trouve que
positions.
c'est un exemple très très positif
I think this is a
de
very
comment
positive
il faut
example
également promouvoir le français
of
et le
how French and
multilinguisme dans les
multilingualism can be
organisations
promoted in
internationales.
international
Merci.
organizations. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Donc vous avez parlé du
So
GAF
you talked about
et
GAF.
justement l'OIF soutient
And
depuis,
the OIF,
depuis plus de 15
for
ans
more
la
than
francophonie dans les
15
organisations
years has been
internationales à
supporting
travers le GAF,
French
mais
in
également
international
à travers le
organizations through GAF,
renforcement
but
des
also through
compétences en langue
strengthening
française des diplomates et des
capacity
fonctionnaires internationaux.
for French-speaking diplomats in
L'OIF
international
œuvre également au
organizations. The
renforcement des
OIF is
capacités
also
des
building
services de
capacity
traduction
in
et
translation
d'interprétariat.
and
L'OIF a mis en
services.
place un
It has
dispositif de veille,
established
d'alerte et
a
d'action pour le multilinguisme et le français
alert
dans les
and
organisations
action-taking
internationales. Et
mechanism
donc, il y a
for French
également,
in
comme vous l'avez
international
dit, le groupe des ambassadeurs
organizations.
francophones. Est-ce
You
que
talked
l'ambassadeur
about
Monceau
the
pourrait nous en dire
GAF.
un
I'm
peu
wondering
plus
if our other
sur le
panelists, Ms. Monceau,
fonctionnement
might
et les
also
objectifs de
tell
ces
us
groupes qui
more
existent,
about
donc pas seulement à Vienne.
how this group works. And it's not just in Vienna. Yes,
Volontiers,
yes, definitely.
un petit détour, si vous le permettez,
Just a
mais
parenthesis first, though.
d'abord remercier
I'd like to
chaleureusement,
extend a very
le TIS,
heartfelt
pas seulement pour
thanks
l'invitation,
for
mais
the,
pour avoir
to the CTBTO,
organisé,
not just for
les
inviting me,
panels
but
de
also
cet
for
après-midi
having
dans cet ordre-là.
organized the panels in the
Commencer
particular order
une
that they did.
conférence aussi
How do you
importante
organize such an important
en pointant un
conference
certain nombre d'enjeux transversaux
with
comme
certain
notamment
cross-cutting
la question
issues,
du
including the matter of
multilinguisme, me
multilingualism?
semble fondamental par rapport à l'essence même du
I
multilatéralisme.
think that this
Et je
is
veux remercier
crucial when it
chaleureusement
comes
le
to the very
secrétaire
meaning of
exécutif Floyd
multilingualism. So
et
I'd
son
like to thank
équipe pour
Executive
avoir
Secretary Floyd
conçu les choses de cette manière.
for
Un
having
petit
organized
détour
our
donc,
conference in this manner.
historique
So just
sur
a little
ce qu'est
bit
la
of
francophonie.
background
Alors, la
on francophonie
c'est une organisation
and the
africaine,
OIF. The OIF is
puisqu'elle a
an
été
African
créée par
organization
3
because it was
chefs
established by
d'État
3
africains,
African heads of state.
Léopold Sédar Senghor,
Dépôt Sédar Senghor,
du
Senegal, Habib Bourguiba,
de
Tunisia, and Ami Diori from
Et
Niger.
ces 3 chefs
These
d'État
3
avaient
heads
pour
of
point
state
commun
had
d'être les premiers
the
chefs de
common
leur
feature of being the first head of
ayant
state of their
récemment
country
accédé à l'indépendance. Et
to have recently acceded to
qu'ils avaient
independence.
en créant
And the
en
goal,
1970,
when they created in
cette
1970 the
organisation,
OIF,
c'était de s'offrir, si je puis dire,
was
un débouché
to ensure that there would be a multilateral platform for them to use,
qui allait leur permettre de se
a place
connecter
where
à ce
they
système
could
multilatéral en plein développement.
be a part
Et c'est
of
très
the rapidly
important
developing
de
multilateral system.
se rappeler à la fois,
It's
évidemment,
very
qu'il s'agit
important
d'une
to
organisation
remember that this is an
africaine,
African
et non pas
organization,
comme on le pense
number
souvent,
one,
et à
and
l'inverse peut-être de nos organisations sœurs comme le
not
Commonwealth,
as we
comme,
think of
le
certain
CEGID,
other
qui,
similar
réunit
organizations
les pays
bringing
hispanophones,
together
ou la CPLP qui
Spanish
réunit
language
les
speaking
pays,
countries
lusophones.
or Portuguese speaking countries.
C'est en sens inverse que se sont
If
faites
you-
les choses.
If you like,
Depuis
this
les-
is sort
les
of
pays
the opposite
anciennement
type of
colonisés,
situation where you
vers,
have formal
les pays
colonies
qui les avaient colonisés et d'autres encore,
interacting
pour
with
aujourd'hui
those who
former une
colonized
communauté,
them and
de
coming
54
together
États
in a
et
community of
gouvernements
54
membres
states
de
and
plein
government,
droit, 88
plenipotentiary
si on ajoute
members,
les États
with
observateurs ou
additional
associés.
observer
Et
states.
l'intérêt, c'est vraiment d'être dans cette logique. Donc votre question
So
porte
the whole
sur les
point, because
groupes
you were asking
d'ambassadeurs
about
francophones.
the groups,
En réalité,
the
il faudrait presque
GAF,
parler d'un intergroupe.
I think this is more
Madame
like an
l'ambassadeur le rappelait,
intergroup,
à
if you
l'instant, le
like. The
fonctionnement
ambassador
multilatéral
talked
est
about
basé sur des groupes
multilateralism usually being based on
régionaux.
regional
La
groups.
francophonie, parmi
Francophonie,
d'autres, permet de
and not
sortir de
just,
cette logique
is a way of
purement
going
géographique ou
beyond
géopolitique
geographical
pour
or
s'inscrire,
political lines.
dans un espace de
It
dialogue
is more
qui
about
réunit
dialogue,
des peuples venant
bringing
dans le cas de
together
la francophonie des
peoples
5
from
continents.
5 continents
Donc
in the
c'est-
case of
c'est
French-speaking
vraiment la logique,
ones.
à tel point que
So that's really the
les
idea.
GAF ont précédé la
To
création
such an
de
extent
la
that
francophonie
GAF
elle-même, de
came actually
l'organisation
before
en tant que telle,
the
puisque le premier
OIF,
groupe
because the
d'ambassadeurs
first group
francophones
of
apparaît à
French
New York en
ambassadors
1965 soit
appeared in
5 ans
1965.
avant l'organisation
So 5
elle-même,
years
et je pense
before
2 ans
the
avant
creation of the
la
OIF,
première
and I think
autre
12 years before
organisation
the next
francophone qui
large
était
French-speaking
l'association des
organization, which would be the
des parlements
organization of
Donc,
French-speaking
voilà, un
parliaments.
espace qui permet
So
vraiment
this
le
is a
dialogue,
platform
qui
for
permet
dialogue.
d'échanger sans aucune pression
And
normative, dirais-je.
in
La
a non-legally
francophonie ne
binding
dicte
context,
aucune
there,
règle,
in
aucun
the sense that
règlement,
there are no rules,
aucun édit d'aucune sorte.
no sort of
Donc,
regulations.
il est tout à fait simple
It's a very
d'échanger
simple
et
format
de
for
créer
discussion.
finalement suffisamment d'implicite, suffisamment de
And
consensus
creating
pour
consensus,
parfois
enough
pouvoir
consensus,
sortir peut-être de certaines impasses pour
sometimes
pouvoir aussi,
that then
je
leads to
crois, envisager
solutions,
l'avenir. Alors, je
solutions
vais
that are
tenter
applied
de
in the
donner
future.
un exemple sur l'impasse
I
et
will
un
give you an
exemple sur
example of a
l'avenir.
stalemate
Alors,
and then
l'exemple sur
an
l'impasse,
example
il
of a
est très
solution
récent, il
used in
vient
the
de
future.
Genève.
The first one
Vous savez,
happened in
peut-être que,
Geneva, a stalemate.
se tient,
You might know about the
encore
nuclear
cette
ban
semaine,
treaty.
se termine la conférence internationale du travail. Un gros blocage là,
So, in
qui
Geneva,
portait sur le budget et qui était
in
vraiment un
Geneva,
blocage
I was
d'ordre
mentioning
culturel,
mentioning
je dirais,
a
par rapport
stalemate that
à
occurred
un
in the
certain nombre de
ILO
conceptions de fond.
on certain
Et,
concepts
c'est
and basic
l'ambassadeur
ideas even,
du
and the
Maroc,
ambassador of Morocco
coordinateur au
was
sein
the
du groupe
coordinator
francophone
in the
de notre coordination
the
thématique
French
sur
thematic
l'emploi et la
group
santé,
regarding
qui a été chargé à la
employment
fois
and
par le
health.
groupe africain,
Well, he was tasked
par
by the African group
l'organisation de coopération
as well as
islamique et par
by
la
the Organization of
francophonie
Islamic
d'être le
Cooperation and the
médiateur. Une
OIF
solution
to
a
be
été
the
trouvée
mediator.
et vous
A
avez vu
solution
dans la
was found,
presse que
and you'll
le
have seen in the
vote a
press
été finalement
that at the end of the day,
positif, que
there was a
le
positive
budget de
outcome
l'organisation a pu être
and the
sauvé.
budget
Et donc
was
c'est
salvaged.
vraiment cette idée
So
de
this is the
médiation.
mediation
Sur l'avenir, alors je pense évidemment au
example.
travail
And then
qui
on
est
the
fait
future.
ici. C'est
What about the work done
un
here?
travail important
Well,
parce
it's
que
very important.
le politique et la politique internationale et
Because
multilatérale trouve
international
son
and
centre de
multilateral
gravité
policy
probablement aujourd'hui
has
quelque
its
part
center of
entre
gravity
le
somewhere
débat
between
culturel
cultural
et le
discussion
débat
and those
technologique.
discussions on technology.
Vous savez qu'un pacte numérique
You know that the
mondial
global
est
digital
en
impact is
discussion, est en
being
négociation
currently
actuellement à New
discussed
York.
in New
Ça serait
York.
le premier texte à
It's going
l'échelle
to be
de la planète, à
the
l'échelle
first
de l'ensemble de la
global
communauté
document
internationale qui
at the level of the
permettrait
international
finalement de se
community,
donner une
one which will
conception
provide a shared
commune
concept
du développement
of digital
numérique.
development.
Là aussi, la francophonie est à l'œuvre.
And here too, francophonie is right in time, alongside our other colleagues. And I'll end by saying that I was referring to francophonie, and perhaps that's a certain ease afforded to be by my language, because indeed francophonie is also a synonym, if you like, of multilingualism. We, as the International Organization of Francophonie, work in French as well as in the local languages of our countries, because ultimately, all of the French-speaking countries have more than one single language, and it's very important to ensure, as was said earlier, Madam, in your preamble, that the people are brought as close as possible to these international and multilateral political debates, and that this be made comprehensible using the languages available to people. That lies at the very heart of our approach and indeed of our political working methodology. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So indeed, as you said, the OIF is an African organization. Now I will turn to address the representative of Côte d'Ivoire. The African continent, similar to the European Union, from the outside, appears to represent a solid bloc here at the Vienna International Center and also in light of other international organizations and in the landmark resolutions adopted. So we're asking, what is the exact situation in French-speaking Africa and the African continent overall? Is there a sense of identity within the group? Could you perhaps describe to us the dynamic within the African group? Thank you very much. Like my colleagues, I also would like to thank CTBTO for organizing this event and also for allowing Côte d'Ivoire to participate in this important encounter. Now, let me answer your question. In terms of negotiations regarding elections, as our colleague pointed out previously, this is on the basis of geographic distribution. So, on the African continent, no distinction is made between either English-speaking or French-speaking groups for two reasons. Firstly, because there's more than just two linguistic communities. We have the Portuguese-speaking community, the Arabic-speaking community, many other linguistic communities on the African continent. Second reason, in all of the capital cities, there is an African group. And this group is responsible for contacting the state's parties, working together with them in order to adopt a common position as regards the major international questions at hand. And these negotiations then are based on consultation and coordination. And when documents are adopted, it is the chair of the African group in each capital who then speaks on behalf of the African group. So once again, we don't make any distinction based on a language distinction. Thank you. Thank you very much for your answer. That was very clear. Now let me turn to France for a specific question as regards CTBTO. Working Group B of the Preparatory Commission has urged the organization to engage in multilingual training in order to help build capacity regarding the use of national data centers. For its part, the Provisional Technical Secretariat, the PTS, has highlighted the need to also implement regional events to that end. This, in turn, has led the CTBTO in 2019 for the very first time for French-speaking NDCs in Madagascar to organize a workshop. And in order to continue these efforts, a second French-speaking regional training course was organized in Niamey in March 2023. Now, 33 experts from 15 French-speaking countries highlighted the benefits of these training courses, facilitating exchanges, allowing them to strengthen their understanding of technical aspects that were presented to them by the PTS experts. Now, as you see it, regarding the use of the French language and, more generally speaking, multilingualism in order to help strengthen the technical capacity of signatory states of CTBTO, do you see this as an essential tool to support multilateralism? Thank you very much, and hello everyone. Thank you very much to the organizers for allowing me to take the floor and to address you here today, and indeed I'm most honored to be able to do so, to address such an illustrious audience as today. Now, you were asking me, why are we seeking to promote multilingualism? Let me give two answers. Based on history and experience, more experience than I may have. And I think it's an important point to recall today, because as you indicated earlier, and as my colleague, the Ambassador of Belgium, also echoed, multilateralism at times is often seen as or presented as being something that comes at a cost for its member states and organizations. But what I want to say to you is this: multilateralism, since the establishment of the United Nations, and indeed the inception of the international community, even if it is not necessarily reflected as such within the Charter, was always a deliberate choice that was made. Why a deliberate choice? Because it enshrined ambitions, and I think that's worth recalling today. It enshrined an ambition, namely the hope of achieving universalization. And this is equally important in light of CTBTO, because the CTBT itself helps to cherish that ambition of reaching universalization. And this is an opportunity to welcome and commend the efforts undertaken by the Executive Secretary, who is joining us this afternoon and who is indeed seeking to achieve the universalization of the treaty. The General Assembly of the United Nations had also made clear that link that we must never forget between universalization, universality, and multilingualism by enshrining in one of its very first resolutions, I think even perhaps the second resolution, which to a certain extent reflects the importance of this aspect, that all states have the right and the duty to make themselves understood and to understand others. Multilingualism clearly is an incontrovertible means in order to reach that aim. Ultimately, the General Assembly then, on numerous occasions, indicated that the use of several languages or more languages should not be seen as a barrier, but rather rather as a means to reach the objectives set forth in the Charter of the United Nations. As such, this is a message worth recalling. Multilingualism truly is a corollary of multilateralism, or perhaps, to use simpler terms, I would say that multilingualism really goes hand in hand with multilateral diplomacy. It's a powerful and effective tool in order to ensure greater international cooperation in the context of the technical cooperation that we were talking about earlier. And it's a reality, it's a fact, that international organizations and the CTBTO also see on a day-to-day basis, in particular when it comes to implementing technical cooperation programs and projects. Some regional or inter-regional organizations only work in French, or mostly in French. And so if the CTBTO really wants to ensure its cooperation is as effective as possible, which is what we all aspire to, and working together with these organizations, it needs to be able to mobilize both resources and French-speaking staff. And it is based on that certainty that underscores the important role of multilingualism in order to ensure greater international cooperation. And this was also made clear at the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, and it is again our shared legacy in a resolution that enshrines multilingualism as one of the fundamental values of the United Nations organization. And I know that some of you, like I, have a very clear preference for resolutions and their texts. I'll read it out to you, and please bear with me if you wouldn't mind. Let me read out to you a few passages of that key resolution, which I believe remain fully relevant, fully topical, in order to answer that question as to why today, here in the CTBT and in all international organizations, why should we continue to promote multilingualism in our work and in our discussions? Now, so here's what the resolution has to say. It says, considering that multilingualism is a fundamental value of the United Nations organization in order to achieve the aims and purposes of the Charter, that is, peace and international security, achieving friendly relations among nations, ensuring international cooperation. Then, aware that multilingualism is a driver of multilateral diplomacy and contributes to promoting the values of the organization, which are equally the values of francophonie, ultimately. Mindful that multilingualism is a means to promote, to protect, and to preserve linguistic diversity and the diversity of cultures worldwide, as well as enhancing the efficiency, effectiveness of results and the transparency of its activities. And then finally, mindful that multilingualism promotes, and this is also something that is very important for all of us here, promotes unity in diversity and ensuring that understanding, dialogue and comprehension prevail. In light of this acknowledgement of the role of multilingualism as a means in international negotiations and discussions to help promote cooperation projects and programs, understanding, tolerance, dialogue, and this acknowledgement of multilingualism as a means to increase transparency, efficacy, I would also add the following, because I believe this also lies at the heart of multilateralism and lies at the heart of the work of organizations such as the CTBTO and of francophonie. I would add the following two ideas, namely equality among states and inclusiveness in debates and in our work. Multilingualism, the use of French, but the use of all of the other languages, the official languages of the CTBTO or of other international organizations, is essentially a factor supporting equality among stakeholders, allowing them to engage in negotiations and discussions. As part of this effort to promote multilingualism, French, well, clearly, and I'm certain you're not surprised to hear me say this, French naturally has an important role to play, given that this is the fifth language most widely spoken in the world, spoken by more than 320 million people, and it is equally a language that is constantly expanding. And I'm sure you won't contradict me on that point. Now, before I finish, and answering your question somewhat more directly, allow me to perhaps flag a risk that is intrinsically linked to a monolingual environment, which is a growing trend in certain fora and perhaps in some international organizations. A risk that is all the more significant, I believe, in scientific and technical fora, such as within the CTBTO, compared to others. Indeed, technical experts, and my Belgian colleague already noted this, are technical experts who often participate actively in debates and who bring their skill and competencies to these discussions and to the decisions being adopted there, may not always have the necessary mastery of these languages. Let's not forget that their university background, after all, the courses that they have followed in most cases frequently were in the languages taught in their countries of origin, or perhaps in other languages of the United Nations, not necessarily in English. And it is those other languages that they use daily in their work in their laboratories, where they are best able to express themselves and best able to convey their technical ideas and analysis. Against that backdrop, again, not being able to draw on multilingualism means we run the risk of drastically curbing the ability of these experts to understand these debates, but above all to participate actively, and in so doing making significant contributions. So I will leave it at that. Again, reinforcing multilingualism and multilateralism, again, that is our goal here, one that we must all continue to support. And I'm delighted to see this panel taking place, demonstrating the commitment of the authorities of this organization to this priority, the shared priority of ours to strengthen multilateralism, with the understanding that in order to do so, we must continue to promote multilingualism. Thank you very much. Thank you. You were underscoring the values of universality through multilingualism as well as equality and inclusiveness, and I believe that brings me now to Ambassador Monceau. I think that these are values that lie very close to your heart. Well, yes, indeed. I was very pleased to hear such a clear and well-detailed presentation. But yes, the multilateral system as it currently works faces two challenges. Let us recall that for the most part, its architecture dates back to the global era, the global pre-digital era, at a time when the fundaments, the principles of the UN system were being established, but which are quite different from the situation that we are currently in, also in terms of the pace of innovation, which has equally had an impact as a result of the digital revolution, moving from a rather linear type of progression to a speed of accumulation, as we can see on nearly a daily basis, to a form of reasoning which is far more spontaneous, instantaneous, changing the relationship between time and space. I would say undoubtedly that the balance between the political debate lies somewhere between the cultural and technological stakes, for the most part these days. If we take stock of immense challenges that we face in terms of peace and security, human rights, development, well, there you will see that that matrix indeed does apply. And it would be difficult to imagine things differently were we not to have that strong desire for inclusiveness, which requires a better understanding of the issues of multilingualism, and not seeing language merely as something that is purely functional, but rather as a vehicle for culture. What conveys, what circulates in a language is not only something that is instantaneous, rather it is a backdrop of historical development, a wealth of development, and at times the only way that we are able to reach someone intellectually. So indeed, this is something that we need to take into account, we need to prepare for, perhaps more than we are so doing.
n'ont pu s'en
It is
préoccuper
something
au
that
cours des
many
dernières
international
années.
organizations
Certes,
have
elles
started
ont,
to look at
quelques
more
excuses,
closely than they have
notamment
in
le fait
recent
que,
years. There may be some
les budgets
excuses,
qui leur sont
budgetary
nécessaires ne
constraints,
sont
for
pas,
instance.
toujours accordés.
Insufficient
Néanmoins,
budgetary resources are
justement,
provided to that end. But yes,
secteur,
indeed,
la question
the issue of multilingualism,
de l'interprétation, de
interpretation,
la traduction
translation,
ne doit pas être le facteur d'ajustement.
these should not be seen as a budgetary adjustment factor.
Et je suppose ne pas être
And
le
I'm
seul
sure
dans
that I'm
cette
not the
salle
only one
de
here
temps en temps les débats de la 5e
who at times
commission
has
à
sat
New
through
York,
debates in the Fifth Committee in New York,
on peut
where
constater
indeed,
que trop
all
souvent,
too often, it is
malheureusement,
unfortunately the
c'est ce qui
case
se
that
passe
that's what
sans
happens
penser aux
without considering the
implications.
implications.
On parle beaucoup
We talk a lot about artificial intelligence
dans tous les
in
domaines.
all areas.
L'intelligence artificielle est
Well,
moins récente
artificial
qu'on veut bien,
intelligence is
le
less
penser, mais une
new
bonne
than you may think it
partie
is,
de
but a good
l'intelligence
share of
artificielle
artificial
générative
generative
est
intelligence
basée
is
sur
indeed
la
based on
documentation
existing
existante,
documentation that is
accessible,
available,
souvent
often
gratuite.
free of
C'est
charge.
intéressant pour les
That's interesting to note
entreprises qui la
for the
développent,
companies developing
dont,
it,
par exemple,
such
sur les
as, for
documents
instance, the
produits par
documents
les
being
Nations
produced by the
Unies.
United Nations.
Et évidemment, le fait qu'il y ait peu de
And again, the
diversité
fact that there is a lack of linguistic diversity has an impact, an impoverishment of thought, of language, and will in turn have a knock-on effect on the artificial intelligence that is thus generated. And this will continue to play an increasing role in all of our lives. So let's be aware of that as a possible stake as well, and let's ensure that we are able to meet those challenges. Let us be able to think ahead, because therein lies the survival, I would say, even above and beyond the multilateral system, of ensuring that we have a balance on this planet, even if there is a great deal of room for improvement. But let's make sure that we are able to do this, bearing these fundamental stakes in mind, proving that we are able to think beyond the short term. Thank you very much. Before I put a question to the ambassador of Belgium, I'd like to remind you that there is a question and answer session, and if you have questions, you can also use the app. I think everybody here has downloaded the app, so you can submit your questions and we'll try to answer them at the end of the session. Belgium. Belgium is a French-speaking country, but also Dutch-speaking and to a certain extent German-speaking. Your diplomats are multilingual, and in your embassies, the three languages are spoken on a daily basis. Now, this multilingualism, which starts off in primary schools in Belgium, and which is part of your diplomatic training, to what extent can this be seen as an asset in the discussions within which Belgium takes part? Thank you very much for that question. Indeed, given its nature, Belgium is able to make a significant contribution to this discussion. And my colleague and my compatriot, Ambassador Monceau, has already started to answer that question, pointing out that language is more than just a set of grammatical examples. It ties in with our cultures, our identities. There are more than 11 million Belgians, but I'm certain we're all very, very different. There's no one single identity, and our Belgian identity is shifting and changes based on the mother tongue that we will have learned. And this is without embarking on a lengthy lecture of Belgian constitutional law. I just recall that indeed our country comprises three different linguistic communities: Dutch-speaking, French-speaking, and German-speaking. And these communities determine the use of languages in the education, in administration, and in their relations, their trading relations, etc., for these separate regions, Flanders, Wallonia, and Brussels. So, principally, each region is monolingual, with the exception of Brussels, which has a particular status because it is bilingual. And so, multilingualism is very much part of our everyday lives in Belgium. It's equally visible within the federal government, where there is linguistic parity, meaning the same number of French-speaking ministers as Dutch-speaking ministers. And beyond all of that, we also have the Prime Minister, who, for the duration of his or her term, regardless of the mother tongue,
on constitue, et ça fait toujours beaucoup rire, on le considère comme asexué
is
linguistiquement.
expected to be a polyglot, a multilingual polyglot.
Ce multilinguisme,
And this
ce plurilinguisme,
multilingualism, bilingualism, trilingualism is something that we practice also in our federal administration, with at least passive bilingualism, meaning that you have the right to speak your own language and the other is supposed to be able to understand that language. In terms of Belgian diplomacy, we are at a minimum trilingual, English, French and Dutch, and here too, parity among the diplomats, same number of diplomats who are Dutch-speaking as well as coming from the Dutch-speaking community and French-speaking diplomats. So parity in numbers. And that linguistic openness, of course, facilitates communication. It makes it easier to understand one another, to appreciate the richness of other languages, of other ways of thinking, and that enables Belgian diplomats, whether it's within Belgium or outside, to engage in closer contacts and also to go about their activities with greater confidence and to be able to convey their messages and to contribite towards consensus finding. Regarding the education system, children start learning their second language at a very early stage, but in some regions such as Wallonia, the choice of language is left up to that pupil, and if a pupil decides not to choose the second national language, they have the freedom to choose English. And it has been noted that 1 out of 3 school children chooses Dutch, whereas it was 1 out of 2 just 8 years ago. So yes, there is a decrease, unfortunately, when it comes to learning the other national language. That is therefore something that we are looking at in Belgium. Even given the omnipresence of bilingualism in our country, it's something that we too have to keep working on. We still have to make efforts in order to keep multilingualism alive and to keep that interest and awareness of the other alive, above all through language. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to another large multilingual country, Côte d'Ivoire. French is the official language of Côte d'Ivoire, but it has never replaced African languages. There are some 60 languages in Côte d'Ivoire. Ivorian languages have also influenced French to the extent that, let me show you this video of Nouchi, a very popular French speaker. I imagine that you can speak and understand several of these languages. Are diplomats of the African continent aware that their multilingualism is an asset and that they are able to benefit from this linguistic wealth? I imagine that often you have to deal with English-speaking diplomats who only speak one language, whereas you speak many. Thank you very much. Côte d'Ivoire, indeed, is one of the founding members of francophonie, contributing thus to strengthening multilingualism, as was so well underscored. And the importance of French in Côte d'Ivoire does not have an effect on the local languages, which in turn have an influence on French. Côte d'Ivoire, therefore, there is a people's language, a mix of French and local African languages spoken. This is Nouchi, which is a proof of effective communication. It's the tool used by young people, some 60% of our population. So yes, at this stage, Nouchi isn't yet a fully fledged language in the group, but it is one of the key languages used for common communication. How did Nouchi develop? Well, as I was saying, we are surrounded by countries with linguistic diversities. There are some 60 ethnic groups. And when the government had to choose official languages alongside French, the peoples of the different communities needed to be able to communicate with one another. That was the first thing to bear in mind. And secondly, when we travel abroad, well, unlike in some countries where you have local languages which are also the national languages, if two Ivorians meet here, well, we will probably have to speak French to one another.
C'est ainsi qu'est né le
So
Nushi.
Nushi
Et aujourd'hui, le Nushi est avancé
has
puisque aujourd'hui le
really become very
dictionnaire
popular to the
français
extent that French
a
dictionaries
reconnu, a intégré aujourd'hui plusieurs
have
mots
even
de
in
Nushi
fact
dans le
included
Larousse
several
français.
Nushi words in
Par
Larousse,
exemple,
in French Larousse.
boucantier qui veut
Boucantier,
dire celui qui
which is
qui
a word
fripe,
which
qui aime
means
le
somebody
luxe,
who enjoys
qui distribue de
luxury.
l'argent lorsqu'il y a des cérémonies. Il y a par exemple le mot go
There
qui
is
se
a
trouve
word
aujourd'hui dans le
go,
dictionnaire français,
which has been added to the
qui
French
signifie la
dictionary. It's
femme.
the term used for
Il y a
women. There are
beaucoup
many
d'autres
other
mots qui
words
sont
now which have
intégrés.
been added as a result.
Et donc, ça veut dire que la Côte d'Ivoire
And
contribue
that
de sa
means that
manière
Cote d'Ivoire is
à
also
l'enrichissement du
contributing
multilinguisme.
to this
Le
growing
deuxième volet de votre
multilingualism.
question,
Now, the
c'est de
second
savoir,
aspect of your
les
question, you
atouts
were
du
asking about the
multilinguisme. Je crois
assets
qu'après
of
les interventions
multilingualism. And I believe
magistrales de mes
after that
collègues de
very
la
interesting
France, de la
presentation of
Belgique
my
et
colleagues
du
from
French,
France and Belgium and my
les atouts
colleagues,
sont
well, I think the
évidents.
assets, the advantages are
Je
very
voudrais
clear.
insister sur
There's
deux
two that
aspects.
I'd like to
Par
highlight.
exemple,
In
l'inclusion
terms of
sociale
social
et
and professional
professionnelle, pour nous
inclusiveness,
qui sommes les diplomates
for us
en
here who
poste,
are
c'est
diplomats,
très
it's very
important. Aujourd'hui,
important
quand il y a des avis de vacances de
that
poste,
whenever vacancy announcements are
si
issued,
vous ne maîtrisez
it
pas
says quite
l'anglais,
clearly, well, if you
bon,
don't
vous
speak English,
partez un peu
you're
handicapé. Donc
disadvantaged from
aujourd'hui,
the
le
outset.
multilinguisme, c'est très
So
important.
multilingualism
L'autre
really is
aspect
important,
à
but another
souligner
aspect
aussi,
to
c'est
bear in
que
mind
certains facteurs de développement et de
has to do with certain
et
developmental
de
factors
dialogue
and
interculturel.
the need
Parce
for
que
intercultural
c'est vraiment
dialogue.
le multilinguisme, c'est une richesse
We need to see
qui
this
ouvre
as
l'esprit,
a tool,
qui
an asset, something that helps
ouvre,
open
qui
minds,
développe les
that
valeurs de
helps
démocratie
strengthen
et de
democratic
tolérance.
values and
Donc, en ce qui nous
tolerance.
concerne, les
And
diplomates
for
africains,
African diplomats, as we
nous
see it,
sommes
we
très
are
conscients
very
des
much
des
aware
avantages
of the
du
advantages of
multilinguisme. Et
multilingualism.
en Côte d'Ivoire
And in
spécifiquement,
particular, in Cote d'Ivoire,
conscient
we
de la
are
valeur
aware
des atouts du
of
multilinguisme.
these
Aujourd'hui, dans
values,
nos systèmes
as we can
scolaires,
see reflected in our
à
school
partir
systems.
du
As
premier
of the
cycle du collège, vous apprenez
you
4
start
langues.
off
Et
learning
qu'il y a
4
le français
languages,
qui est
the
obligatoire,
early years in
le
school,
l'anglais est
French and
obligatoire,
English,
il y a 2 langues internationales
and
au
then
choix.
2 other languages at
C'est-à-dire
choice,
l'arabe
Arabic
et l'allemand.
and German, are on offer.
Et je peux vous dire qu'aujourd'hui, en
In
Afrique
sub-Saharan
subsaharienne, la
Africa,
Côte
Cote
d'Ivoire
d'Ivoire
est
is
le
the
pays
country actually
qui a le
with
plus
the
grand nombre
largest
d'enseignants
number of
allemands. On a
German
2500
students,
professeurs allemands et
German-speaking
plus de
teachers
2 millions d'apprenants
also.
en allemand. Mais malheureusement, cette politique
And
ne continue
unfortunately,
pas à
this
l'université.
doesn't continue to university because after secondary
Une fois que vous
school,
choisissez votre
once
filière à
the
l'université,
students
il y a une
choose
interruption.
their
Donc, au niveau des langues
vocational
locales aussi,
choices,
depuis
then
2001,
unfortunately there's
le
an
gouvernement
interruption.
a décidé de valoriser les
We've
langues
decided
locales
also
africaines.
to prioritize
Ainsi,
local
il y a un
African
projet
languages, and there
qui
is
est
an
en
ongoing
cours,
project to that end
qui connaît 3 phases. Il y a
based
l'expérimentation,
on an experimental
la
phase,
régionalisation
partial
partielle, et
regionalization,
puis la
and then
généralisation.
a
Nous sommes
generalization
actuellement au stade
stage.
de
Right now, we're at the
l'expérimentation.
early
Il y a
pilot
10
phase where we
langues
have some
locales qui
10
sont
local
enseignées
languages
au
that are being
préscolaire
taught
et à
in
l'école
primary school
primaire
and in
dans
preschool
10
in
villages.
10
Et je pense
villages.
qu'après cette
And I think
phase,
after
nous
that
allons passer
pilot
à la
stage, we'll move on to the next one, which is the partial regionalization phase. And then finally, generalization. So, to sum up, indeed, for diplomats, multilingualism really is an advantage. Thank you very much.
Merci. Merci.
Thank you.
J'ai une dernière question. Alors, je pense
I have one
qu'on a
last
déjà
question.
répondu
I think
partiellement, mais
you've
je vais quand même vous la reposer
already
parce que je pense qu'il
partially
y a des choses à
Because I think
redéfinir.
there are perhaps
Les
things that
organisations
need to be
internationales
redefined.
reconnaissent la diversité
International
des peuples et
organizations
des cultures de leurs
recognize the
États membres, et
diversity
cela
of people
passe
and
par leur
cultures,
reconnaissance de la
and
diversité
thus
des
the
langues.
diversity of languages.
On a vu en quoi le
We
respect
saw
du multilinguisme était une
that
condition
upholding
essentielle du
multilingualism
multilatéralisme,
is
mais en quoi c'est aussi un gage
key
de
for
bonne gouvernance des relations
multilateralism, but
internationales.
also
Je pose la question
good
à la
governance, and
représentante
I'm
de la
wondering
France.
if you could each share your view on this. France
Merci
first,
beaucoup.
please. Thank you.
Comme je l'ai
As I had
souligné,
underscored.
Fondamentalement, le multilinguisme
Basically,
encourage aussi,
multilingualism
l'efficacité, est un
improves
facteur d'efficacité et
efficiency
il encourage, il
and
permet
also
une plus
ensures
grande
greater
transparence.
transparency.
Il rend les travaux des
It
organisations
makes the work of international
internationales plus
organizations
accessibles
more
à un certain nombre
accessible
de leurs
to
États
some member
membres, mais pas
states,
seulement à leurs
but not
États
just to
membres.
member
Il rend
states.
aussi les travaux
It
des
also means
organisations
that the work of
internationales, le fruit de
international
leurs
organizations
réflexions,
and the
fondamentalement plus
outcomes and
accessibles
discussions
à
are
nos
more accessible
populations,
to
à nos
everyday
peuples
people
et à nos
and
sociétés qui
societies.
ont un intérêt, du moins je
who
l'espère, et en
I
tout cas
hope,
c'est ce à quoi un diplomate
and
s'efforce tous
this
les
is
jours,
what I think all diplomats work for.
et d'intéresser nos populations,
I hope that our work is
nos
of
opinions
interest
publiques, nos
to our people,
contribuables
our
aussi,
taxpayers,
qui contribuent
who
à
are
financer le
contributing
travail
to
de
the
ces
financing of these
organisations
international
internationales, et bien tout
organizations
simplement à ce qu'elles font, et
and
on le
to what
fait
they're
d'autant
doing.
mieux qu'elles le font
So all the better that this be done in various languages, making this work in turn, the publications, the documents more accessible to the broader public. Thank you. I would like to go now to the last section of the discussion. We've understood the advantages of multilingualism and the contribution of francophonie. So let's perhaps broaden our horizons. I'll go to the OIF first, I think. In the Djerba statement adopted last year by heads of state and government of French-speaking countries, you have the following sentence. In international and regional organizations where the French language is an official and or working language, if this is our only official language, we in written and spoken communication will express ourselves in French. This is great to see on paper, but what will it look like as applied in international organizations? I think that collectively we have provided quite a bit of response to that question already. I'd actually like to go back maybe though to one aspect, namely that often the OIF and other types of organizations, except for Commonwealth, of course, are experience pressure because people say, what could you do more for the language? And I think that's going about it the wrong way around. That is because very often international organizations are counting on some organizations based on language. And it doesn't matter if it's French or Spanish or other languages, and they count on them perhaps for additional support when it comes to translation, interpretation. But as I was attempting to explain earlier, that's not really the challenge. It's not so much about ticking the box, ensuring that there's some sort of formal commitment. No, it's more about understanding the extent to which it is key to have this type of openness and this type of exchange in an international system to ensure that discussions are as most genuine as possible. It's clear that more languages, many more languages, should be present in international discussions. And maybe that will be possible rather quickly thanks to technological progress, in particular in certain fora. But an attitude of openness is necessary, as is political will. Within the organizations themselves. It's important that each individual understand this. In Djerba, the heads of state and government, in adopting the declaration, were attempting to express the idea. I mean, sometimes diplomats themselves come under pressure and find themselves in awkward positions in monolingual contexts. Or with a limited number of languages, and of course this could happen to heads of state themselves too. And this is all very complicated in a changing world. But let's remain mindful of the fact that without diversity, the collective world we are building will be much more at risk and will be lacking much more. So there's a direct connection between multilingualism, innovation, and technology, the main topics of this conference, and then the ultimate goal of the maintenance of international peace and security globally. Thank you.
Je vais me tourner vers la France
I'd like to
maintenant.
go back to France.
Toujours à la recherche de solutions concrètes,
As we seek
la France avait, à
specific
l'occasion de la
solutions,
présidence
during
du
France's
Conseil de l'Union
presidency of the
européenne
EU
en
in
2022,
2022,
commandé au professeur
France
Christian Lequen un
asked
rapport sur la
Professor
diversité
Christian
linguistique et
Lequen
la langue
to
française dans les institutions
draw up a
européennes.
report on linguistic
Nous
diversity
avions reçu son
in
auteur
European
à Vienne l'année dernière, je
institutions.
crois que certains d'entre vous
We
étaient
heard the
présents.
conclusions
Et
last
comme
week.
il
I
le
think some
disait,
of you were present. He
l'objectif de
said
ce
that
rapport
the
n'est
goal
pas
of
de
the
chercher à
report was not
remplacer le
seeking to replace
monolinguisme anglais
English
par un
monopoly with the
monolinguisme
French
français.
one.
Il s'agit de réellement
This was
promouvoir
about
le
promoting
multilinguisme car la défense du
multilingualism
français
because
passe par
defending
celle de la
French
diversité
also
linguistique.
means defending
Ce rapport,
linguistic
qu'on appelle
diversity.
rapport Lequen,
The PowerCan
présente une série de
report
recommandations
presents a series of recommendations
pour les
for
institutions européennes, mais
European
certaines pourraient vraiment
institutions,
être appliquées
but
à
also some which could
l'ensemble des
have applications
organisations
in international
internationales.
organizations as well.
Est-ce que la France, en tant
I'm wondering
puisque vous
if
tenez le secrétariat
France,
du GAF,
because you're
est-ce qu'il y a des mesures concrètes
holding
que vous avez retenues et que vous
the
pensez pourraient aider
Secretariat
à
of GAF
la
currently,
mise en œuvre
we're
de plus
wondering what
francophonie et
could
de
contribute to
multilinguisme
greater
dans les
multilingualism in
organisations
international
internationales?
organizations and French being more widely used. Thank
Merci
you.
beaucoup. Et merci
Thank
de
you for having
mentionner
mentioned the
ce
report.
rapport qui était en effet l'un des axes forts de la réflexion française
This was
sur le
a
multilinguisme
centerpiece
durant
of
notre
the
présidence de
discussions
l'Union
held under the
européenne.
French presidency
Alors,
of the
comme vous l'avez dit,
European
ce
Union.
rapport
As you said, the
comporte
report
26
contains 26
C'était
recommendations.
tout à fait
They were
intéressante
very
et stimulante. Alors, je sens bien que là
interesting
maintenant, comme
and
je vous ai
provided
déjà
food for
cité un
thought.
certain
As
nombre
I've
de
already
considérants d'une
quoted
résolution,
certain paragraphs
sans
from a
doute vous avez peur
resolution,
que
you
je
might
vous
be
cite
worried
les
that I'm
26
going to now read out the
recommandations.
26
Alors, je vous rassure, je n'en
recommendations,
ferai
but I'm
rien,
definitely
et j'en
not going to do
sélectionnerai,
that.
simplement
I'll just pick a
quelques-unes.
few.
Alors, la première qui nous semble peut-être
The first
un point de
recommendation
départ,
that we think is a
ça serait
good
comme,
starting point
cela se
is,
fait à l'ONU à
with
nouveau,
respect to what is done in the UN,
d'encourager
is
la
about
production chaque année d'un
encouraging
rapport
the
sur le
issuance of a
multilinguisme
yearly report
qui
on
permette
multilingualism
de procéder à une
for
évaluation
an
de la
assessment
pratique du
of multilingualism in
dans les
practice in
organisations
international
et notamment,
organizations,
à
and in
l'autisme.
particular in the
Il y a une autre
CTBTO. There was
proposition
another proposal
qui
made,
est bien connue mais qui garde
which is
vraiment
well
toute
known,
son
but which is
importance,
nonetheless
c'est celle de
very
demander un
relevant,
recours
that is
systématique à l'interprétation
asking for
dans les
systematic
groupes de
use of
travail. Pas
interpretation
seulement,
in
en
working groups, so
plénière,
not
mais
just in
aussi dans les
plenaries,
groupes de
but
travail.
interpretation
Alors,
for
c'est ce qui
working
est fait
groups
à
as well.
l'autisme. Je ne dirais certainement pas le contraire pour toutes les sessions
For
formelles
all
de la
formal
commission
sessions in the
préparatoire et de ses organes
CTBTO, in
subsidiaires.
the PrEP
Et
Commons
d'ailleurs,
subsidiary bodies,
de
this is
récents
actually
progrès
what
ont
is
été faits
done.
dans ce domaine,
Progress has been made
puisque
because
désormais,
now
les sessions
the
des
sessions
groupes
of
d'experts
expert
du groupe de
groups of
travail B
WGB are also
sont également
interpreted.
interprétées. Et puis, il est possible aussi de regarder à la
And
demande
then it would
sur le site
be
sécurisé de
possible
l'autisme
to look at the
des
request
sessions
the
des
on
différents organes
the secure
statutaires
website of the
avec
CTBTO
une bande-son,
videos,
dans les 6
and
langues.
you
Tout
have
ça, ce
those
sont
in all 6
certainement de
languages.
réels
Those
progrès,
are
il faut le
examples
souligner,
of
le
actual
reconnaître et le
progress,
saluer.
which should be welcomed.
Le recours à
So the use of
l'interprétation
interpretation
soulève néanmoins
is
encore un certain nombre de désaccords, on le
definitely
sait,
subject to
car il
a
implique
certain
une
amount of
augmentation
disagreement
des
because it
coûts,
does have
et donc
cost
du budget des
implications
institutions
for
concernées.
the budgets of the relevant organizations, but I hope that with my appeal you heard earlier, you're very convinced of the need to allocate those funds to promote multilingualism. There's something else that could be explored that would be simply beginning to write source documents in languages other than English again. So limiting the drafting of documents being published in just one language, usually that would be English, to 50% of total documents produced. I'm sure you're very aware of this next challenge. It's part of the linguistic practices of staff of the organization, in particular managerial staff. Usually this type of staff is using English. It's a social practice because studies show that in reality, and we think this is promising, gives rise to hope, that they definitely haven't forgotten all of those other languages that they speak, and definitely those include other languages other than English. So this is simply a matter of encouraging the practice of foreign languages other than English. What could also happen would be that there would be a statutory obligation to prove certain linguistic skills when applying for promotion.
plus loin.
But probably this won't happen for some
Enfin,
time.
ça se joue
And
bien
then,
sûr au niveau des processus de
in
recrutement,
recruitment
car à l'heure
processes,
actuelle, la seule maîtrise
currently,
de l'anglais suffit
all that's
pour
required
intégrer
is
certaines
English,
organisations,
so
et je crois
as
que
to be
l'OTIS en
hired
fait
in certain
partie.
organizations, I
Alors
think
peut-être
including
que demander
CTBTO. So perhaps
ou mettre en place des épreuves dans 2 langues serait déjà un immense
linguistic
pas.
testing in 2 languages.
Enfin, je voudrais mentionner
That might help.
une dernière
And then
piste
finally,
pour faire
a
vivre le
third idea to
multilinguisme
promote
dans les institutions
multilingualism
comme
in
l'OTIS,
the
c'est celle de
CTBTO inter
permettre
alia.
aux
That would be
utilisateurs
to
d'accéder
ensure
le
that
site
users
internet
can
institutionnel en
surf
plusieurs
the
langues.
website in
Et
many
à ce stade,
languages,
certainement,
because at
comme
this
vous le
stage, and
mentionniez,
I think the
Monsieur
ambassador
l'ambassadeur,
said this already,
l'innovation technologique et la traduction
technological
automatique seront
innovation
sans doute un
and
moyen
AI
efficace qui vont nous
translation
aider
can help
pour
us
évoluer aussi vers plus de
in
multilinguisme dans
promoting
la
multilingualism
communication
in official
officielle.
communications.
Alors évidemment, il faudra un certain nombre de clauses de protection
Clearly, there
juridique,
would have to
il faudra
be
des
many legal
investissements
protection
massifs,
clauses
une
and
fois
huge
encore, dans des
investment
logiciels de
in
traduction,
translation
mais c'est en tout cas,
software,
une voie
and not
prometteuse.
just, but I think that this is a promising means as well.
Merci.
Thank you.
Je vais maintenant passer la parole
will
à
now
la
give
Côte
the
d'Ivoire,
floor to Côte
puisque
d'Ivoire.
on l'a vu, l'origine de
Because as we saw,
l'Organisation internationale de la francophonie, c'est l'Afrique.
OIF
Mais
originated
l'avenir de la
in
francophonie
Africa,
passe
but
aussi par l'Afrique.
ling-
On compte
but the
aujourd'hui
future of
327 millions
francophonie
de
does
francophones
too.
en 2023,
300 and
soit une progression de 6 millions par rapport à 2022. Et cette
Tout lié
progression
à la
est surtout liée à la croissance de la population, alors que l'Europe perd des francophones.
the French-speaking population
Pensez-vous que
in
cette
Africa
maîtrise
is
du
rapidly
français
growing
qu'ont les
while it
diplomates
is diminishing
ivoiriens
in
et vos
Africa.
collègues de
So
l'Afrique
what I'm
francophone
wondering
puisse devenir un
is if
atout
you think
dans les
speaking
discussions
French can be an
internationales
advantage in
au vu de la
international
progression de la
discussions when
francophonie.
it comes to ensuring
Merci
progress
beaucoup.
for French being
Je
spoken
pense que je
in
pourrais
general.
ajouter que
Thank
l'Afrique
you. Well, I think that we could add
aussi bien
that
le berceau,
Africa
mais
is
comme vous l'avez
also
dit, l'avenir de la
the
francophonie.
cradle, but also the future
Au-delà des données
of
démographiques, il y a aussi les
French
données
being
économiques.
speaken. So there's economic
Pendant
data
longtemps,
as
l'Afrique a
well.
été présentée
For quite some time,
comme
Africa was being
un
presented
continent de misère.
as a
mais
poor
tout le monde
continent,
constate
but it
aujourd'hui
is
que
clear to everyone today
l'émergence
that
se trouve en Afrique.
dynamism
Les
is
pays
growing
africains sont
in
engagés
Africa,
sur la voie de
emerging
l'émergence
economies.
et du développement économique. Et cela se traduit par, vous voyez, tous les
You
grands
can see
pays
this
aujourd'hui ont un cadre de coopération avec l'Afrique.
with all
citer
leading
France
countries
Afrique,
signing
Inde Afrique,
cooperation
Chine
agreements
Afrique,
with
tout ça.
Africa,
Donc,
France,
au-delà des
Africa,
données
China,
démographiques, il y
Africa,
a aussi les
etc.
données
So
économiques.
beyond demographic data, there are
Font
also
croire que
economic data
l'avenir de la
which
francophonie, c'est
do
aussi
lead
en Afrique.
to believe
À
that
cela
the
s'ajoute un
future of
troisième
French is in
élément, il y
Africa.
a le nombre
Then you have the
d'apprenants.
number of those learning French in
Aujourd'hui,
Africa.
le nombre
Today,
d'apprenants en français progresse en
there are an
Afrique.
increasing number of people learning
Y
French
compris les
in
pays
Africa,
francophones,
in
mais aussi les
French-speaking
pays
African
anglophones.
countries, but also in
Si vous
English-speaking
avez,
ones.
il y a des pays comme
Take
le
Ghana,
Ghana,
for an
il y a
example.
des pays comme le
Zimbabwe,
Zimbabwe, l'Afrique
South
du Sud.
Africa.
Le nombre d'élèves
The
dans
number
les
of
alliances
students in
françaises
French,
est très important.
in French
Et au-delà de tout ça,
institutions is growing.
ce que je voudrais préciser, c'est que
Beyond
ce n'est
this,
pas un acquis.
I would
C'est vrai
say
que nous avons les
that
données
this is
économiques, les données démographiques. Et la francophonie
not
doit
just
continuer à jouer son
a
rôle,
given.
être éveillée parce
French
que
must continue to be
il
promoted
y a aussi la menace
because
d'autres
there are
langues,
other languages looming on the
comme vous le
horizon.
savez. Donc,
as you know.
il y a l'hégémonie
There's
de
the
l'anglais, dont
monopoly
on a
of
parlé tout à
English, we
l'heure,
talked about that
mais il y a
earlier,
aussi la persistance de certaines
but
idées
also
reçues.
certain
Et
stereotypes that
aujourd'hui, la
continue
jeunesse
today.
africaine représente 60% de la population. Et
Today,
les idées
you have a
reçues, c'est
huge
le français est
population of youth
considéré
in
comme
Africa.
une
French
langue
is seen
coloniale,
as a colonial
pour
language for
certains,
some,
une langue d'aliénation,
one which
ou bien une
alienates
langue de
people,
domination
or
de la
even
classe élitiste.
the language
Donc
of
ça veut
the
dire qu'il
elite.
y a du travail de
So I
sensibilisation
think that means that there has to
à
be
faire à ce
some
niveau pour briser
outreach
ces idées
so as to
reçues-là.
counter these
Dans ce
stereotypes.
contexte, pour le diplomate africain
In
comme
this
ivoirien,
context, for an African diplomat
la
or
francophonie,
one
c'est
from
un
Côte
atout.
d'Ivoire,
Vous avez donné
French
quelques données
is an
tout à
advantage.
l'heure.
You gave some data earlier.
Le monde francophone aujourd'hui,
The
c'est 16% du
French-speaking world
PIB
is
mondial.
16% of global GDP.
La francophonie, la
Francophonie
langue
or French
française, c'est la
language is
sixième
the
langue utilisée dans le monde, la deuxième la plus
sixth
apprise
broadest
et la
spoken
troisième
language,
langue dans le monde des
and the
affaires.
third in
Donc
terms
pour
of
nous,
the
diplomates
business
africains,
world. So
avec une
on
communauté
the
linguistique
African
qui
continent,
comporte plus de 88
we
pays,
have
88
about
entités
98
affiliées,
countries
c'est une
affiliated,
opportunité par rapport à la mission du diplomate
and
africain
that
aujourd'hui qui
means
est la diplomatie
that
économique.
it is definitely an advantage for African diplomats, those of my country in particular. They can promote their countries through using French, as well as business opportunities for African businesses. So I think if you look at it that way, speaking French is an advantage. Finally, it would be important when it comes to alliances of French speakers and positions taken regarding challenges, that there be more consistency. As I said, African youth today are much more swayed by some certain positions taken by French speakers in Africa, the democratic values that are promoted in francophonie organizations, the rule of law, upholding human rights. All of these are things that need to be emphasized so as to ensure that African youth have confidence in francophonie organizations, to see that they are key stakeholders politically, nationally. Thank you.
Je vous remercie. J'ai une dernière question pour la Belgique avant qu'on passe aux questions du public. J'aimerais parler du multilatéralisme qui est aujourd'hui confronté à de multiples crises, notamment la guerre en Ukraine, mais également la mise en œuvre partielle de l'accord de Paris sur le climat, la sortie des États-Unis, un certain nombre de traités. L'ambassadeur Monceau l'a évoqué tout à l'heure, la francophonie peut apporter des blocages face à des situations tendues, des négociations ardues. Est-ce que vous auriez d'autres exemples, peut-être d'autres situations où la francophonie et le
francophonie or multilingualism can provide solutions?
Oui, je pense que mes collègues ont déjà
Yes, well, I think that my colleagues have shared several examples. They've describe certain advantages of multilingualism and speaking French, and I'd like to emphasize two, which were just shared from my colleague from Côte d'Ivoire. I mean, basically not taking anything for granted, not resting on our laurels, focusing on youth and other communities regarding the importance of French. And more simply put, the importance of speaking other languages as vehicles of other cultures and means of communication. And then I touch upon what my French colleague said. I'm looking in the room, and of course the spotlights mean that I can't see everything, but I don't see a lot of people wearing earpieces. And what that means is we're preaching to the choir. I think that the French ambassador said that multilingualism needs to be promoted to those who think that they least need it, and that means English native speakers. I think that's very important. So, independently of the second language learned, be it French, Arabic, or Chinese, whatever that language may be, it's extremely important to ensure communication can happen. Then coming back to your question about multilingualism and francophonie when it comes to various crises, well, as was already said, I think when it comes to facilitating negotiations and mediation, it's extremely important. It ensures mutual understanding, seeking shared solutions. It has an important role to play in those exchanges. French and multilingualism could mean promoting inclusive dialogue. Yes, I said that earlier. I talked about the group of French-speaking ambassadors, while positions may not all be shared, the language is, and this means that we can express our positions more clearly and to find common positions. Language, though,
exclusif.
can also
Et
be
justement, vous faisiez référence à
a
l'Ukraine.
factor of
Je pense
exclusion.
que
When I think about
depuis l'invasion
Ukraine,
russe en Ukraine,
since the Russian
Ukrainiens, du
invasion
moins
of
de ce que j'entends à
Ukraine,
Vienne,
at least what I've heard at the
n'utilisent plus
UN
du tout le
is
russe
that
dans
Ukrainians
les
are no longer
organisations internationales et
using
sont passés à
Russian
l'anglais.
at all in
Et là, c'est
international
un signal
organizations.
politique
They
très fort,
use
parce que
English
je pense que
instead.
la
That is a
majorité
very
de
strong
leurs
political
diplomates et de leurs
message,
experts s'expriment
because
beaucoup
I
mieux en
think that
russe,
their diplomats and
qu'en
their
anglais,
experts
mais c'est un signal en
express
disant,
themselves
nous,
much better in
nous
Russian, but it's a
rejetons
very
cette
clear
langue qui fait partie
message that
quelque
we
part
are
de notre
rejecting
culture,
that
mais
world
qui est la
and
langue de notre
thus
envahisseur,
that
et avec
language, which
cela,
is the
nous
language
donnons
of the
un
invader.
message
And so
politique
it is
fort.
a strong political message that they're
Nous avons
sending.
parlé là tout à l'heure aussi des compréhensions
We talked
que la langue,
about
c'est
the
plus que juste
understanding
une
or the
langue,
notion that
c'est une
language is
meilleure
more than just
compréhension
that.
des
It is
enjeux
better
politiques, des
understanding
enjeux
political and
culturels,
cultural
qui
challenges,
peuvent être
what
très
is at
importants
stake, that can be
comprendre dans
very
une
important to
négociation.
understand in
Et
a
je voudrais peut-être
negotiation.
citer comme dernier point aussi quelque chose
My
qui a
last
été dit
point
par ma
might
collègue
also be
française,
something that
c'est
my
le
French
fait
colleague
que
said,
le
namely that
multilinguisme permet
multilingualism,
aussi, au-delà des négociations qui
beyond
se retrouvent en petits
negotiations,
comités et
in
dans
small
une salle
committees,
ou dans
in
une
a room
organisation
or in
internationale
an
fermée,
international
mais de faire
organization,
passer des messages et d'avoir un soutien
multilingualism can be a way
de la
of
base,
garnering
disons, du
grassroots
grand
support,
public,
the support of the
que
public,
de nos concitoyens, et je pense que ça
our
c'est très
citizens,
important.
and I think that's very
Merci.
important.
Merci.
Thank you.
Je pense qu'on a le temps, on a
I
quelques
think we
minutes
have a
encore pour
few
des
more
questions du
minutes for
public.
questions from the audience.
N'hésitez pas à lever
So just
la
raise your
main
hand
et vous aurez un micro qui va vous
and
arriver comme par enchantement.
a microphone will be brought over.
S'il n'y a pas de questions,
If there are no questions, then I'll take
Pas de
questions,
questions dans la
online
salle.
questions. No questions in the room.
Donc, une des premières questions,
So one of the
qui nous
first
est parvenue en
questions we
ligne,
got
et je vais
online,
vous
and
la
I'll read
lire,
it.
la
The
traduction des
translation
documents
of
a un coût non
documents has a
négligeable
high
pour
cost
certaines
for certain
organisations
international
internationales.
organizations.
Alors, la mise en
So
place d'un
setting up
fonds
a
dédié
fund
à cet
for
effet par le
this
groupe des pays
for
francophones est-elle une bonne
French-speaking
solution?
countries, do you think that would be a good
Je sais pas si c'est le
solution?
secrétariat qui
I'm
répond,
not
si
sure if it would be the
l'OIF,
OIF or the Secretariat to
D'autres
respond
questions?
to respond to this.
Alors oui, ça a un coût,
Yes, indeed,
c'est
it does
évident.
have a cost.
Tellement de choses ont un coût
Many things do.
important.
Many things cost a lot.
Et les processus délibératifs de manière générale,
Generally speaking,
les processus
negotiations, democratic
démocratiques
processes,
ont un coût important
all have
et
a high cost.
nécessitent une information
They-
pertinente, adéquate.
They
Ceci en fait
require
partie,
appropriate,
ni
sufficient
plus ni moins.
information.
Voilà, donc après les solutions techniques qui peuvent être trouvées sur le plan
Technical
de
solutions
l'ingénierie
that could be
financière,
possible in terms of
bon, je crois qu'il y a une
in
grande
terms of
variété,
financial
qui
innovation.
peuvent
Well,
être,
I'm sure there are
imaginées,
many
qui
of those
doivent
type of
continuer
solutions
à
that
être,
could be
à être
that could be
identifiées. Mais
explored.
je le redis, ça a été dit également par
But
par
allow me to just repeat it, and I believe
l'ambassadrice de
that
la
the French
France.
ambassador said this as well.
Il y a aujourd'hui de
There are
plus
an
en plus de
increasing number
solutions
today of
technologiques,
technological
qui
solutions
permettent une traduction à moindre
which
coût.
allow
Il y a
for
notamment,
lower cost
par exemple,
translation.
un
For an
outil,
example,
que l'on va
there
rendre
is a tool we'll
public,
be making public
très
in the near
prochainement,
future.
mis au point par
It was designed
l'Organisation
by
mondiale de
the
la propriété
Global
intellectuelle,
Intellectual
basée à
Property
Genève,
Organization,
et
WIPO.
avec qui nous avons travaillé pour la version francophone, mais qui va
They worked for us
exister
to create a
dans toutes
French
les langues
version, but it's
officielles des
going
Nations
to be
Unies,
translated
qui
into all
permet, par
UN
exemple, de
official
sortir d'une
languages,
réunion
which means
comme
that you could
celle-ci
come out of a
avec le
meeting
compte-rendu
like
déjà
this one
établi
with
dans toutes les langues de
the
travail.
summary record
Et
in
ça,
the
c'est
language you're
une
interested in
intelligence
that would be
artificielle
generated by
générative,
AI.
qui permet de le faire de manière quasi
And
instantanée.
it would be
Là,
almost
il y a
in
des
real
coûts de
time.
développement,
There
mais
are
après, il y a,
development costs,
moins
of
de
course,
coûts, évidemment, de
but later on
production
there
à
are
l'unité.
lower
Donc,
production costs.
les solutions
So there are
existent.
solutions.
Et encore une fois, je crois que tout le propos,
Again,
et j'insiste beaucoup pour dire qu'il
and
ne
I'm
s'agit pas d'un
perhaps
plaidoyer pour le
repeating myself,
français,
but this isn't
uniquement,
about
mais
appealing
vraiment d'un
for the
plaidoyer
use of
pour le
French, but rather for
multilinguisme. Je crois que nous nous
multilingualism.
rejoignons tous
I think we
pour
all
le
agree.
dire. Le propos, c'est qu'il s'agit là de quelque chose d'essentiel et de consubstantiel au multilatéralisme. Donc, après, se poser des questions, je dirais, prosaïques.
So then
ça fait partie, bien sûr,
there may
du débat,
be certain related questions. They're part of the discussion, but we can't prejudge the discussion itself.
Que je trouve très
That
intéressante.
takes me to my next
Quelqu'un qui nous
question.
écrit
Someone has
qu'il
written
semble
that
que les
it seems that
francophones sont en
French
première ligne
speakers are in
de la
the front
défense du
lines of defending
multilinguisme. Est-ce que c'est le cas? Est-ce
multilingualism.
qu'on est vraiment les
Do you think
francophones
that's
ou
true?
on a d'autres groupes
Or do you think there are other
linguistiques qui se battent
linguistic
également
groups who
pour
are
le
also
multilinguisme?
fighting for multilingualism? Who would like to answer this? Ambassador?
Oui, je pense que pas du tout. Il n'y a,
no,
il y a pas de
I
monopole
don't
de
think
la
at
langue
all that it's
française
only
sur
French
sur
speakers.
ce débat. Je pense que
I
l'espagnol
think
est en très bonne
that
position.
you have
Et
Spanish
d'autres,
speakers as
je
well.
regarde par exemple au niveau
And
de
then in
l'Union
the
européenne
EU,
où les trois
you have
langues
the
de
three
travail
working languages,
sont le
French,
français,
English,
l'anglais
and
et
German.
l'allemand, et où aussi les représentants
And so there, the German
sont
speakers
souvent très à
are
cheval sur le
extremely
respect de ces règles. Donc je ne pense
active
pas du tout que c'est
in
que c'est
upholding
juste
multilingualism.
dans
So
la
no,
sphère
I don't think this is just a matter of
qu'on
French
essaye de promouvoir et de
speakers
maintenir
promoting
le
or
multilinguisme.
maintaining multilingualism.
Est-ce que quelqu'un voudrait compléter?
Merci. Je voudrais revenir
Thank you very much. I just wanted to come back briefly to the previous question, simply to say that if we all agree that multilingualism is a type of universally shared value, well, to a certain extent, I'd like to say it's a common good, if you like, a shared good. And perhaps on that basis, then, we might see it as being in harmony with recognition of that common value, that common good, namely, everyone who participates in it contributes to ensuring this multilingualism really exists, that it lives. And I would really ask all the different language groups to do their part in sharing the costs of translation, of documentation in their language. It might sound like an easy solution, but really, if not, then we're denying the fact that multilingualism is a common good and a common value. So I would suggest that we start thinking about solutions similar to what the ambassador was outlining earlier, based on innovation, rather than just focusing on cost cutting. And I agree entirely with my colleague in saying that no, francophonie isn't the only group or community that is seeking to uphold this value of the use of French in this case, but rather, broadly speaking, multilingualism. And indeed, we are in dialogue with the other language communities. The group of French-speaking ambassadors talks to the other groups of the other linguistic groups here represented internationally in Vienna, so that all of these languages work together, not just French on its own. Then thank you all very much. Well, thank you. Unless anybody has something to add, then I would simply like to thank all the four panelists for their enriching presentations, and I'd like to thank the audience very much for its attention. Please don't forget that at 6:30 we have a roundtable in French, regional capacity building activities for operators and directors of IMS stations in the African French-speaking countries. There will be no interpretation, unfortunately, but at the same time there will also be a Spanish-speaking panel and an Arabic-speaking panel. So thank you all very much and enjoy your afternoon.